Hello, everybody. My name is Sanjay Parikh. I am one of the founding members of Indegene, and I'm actually delighted to be here to have you all here in this virtual IDS session. Thank you so much for participating from wherever you are. During the course of today, we've obviously heard several experts and thought leaders share their insights and perspectives about the future of R&D, uh, especially in the Gen AI related world. And I'm sure you will agree that there are exciting times ahead of us for this industry as well as for the work that we do for patients. With that, it's on me to try and close out this idea session uh, by kind of presenting some thoughts on what we think the future of R&D will be in the age of Gen AI, right? And that is really the title on the first slide. It's always risky to attempt to predict the future, especially as it relates to the impact of extreme innovation and disruption, the kind of era that we live in right now. Very often, we tend to overestimate the impact of such innovation in the short term, but underestimate the impact in the long term. However, when it comes to Gen AI, we all know that the pace at which things are happening is just unprecedented. And therefore, the gap between the short term and the long term seems to be shrinking faster than ever before. One may say at one level that the future is already here. In the context of pharma R&D, therefore, we believe that Gen AI is no longer an option, but it will constitute the competitive edge in the short term, and over the long term might even become just par for the course. With that, let's dive in, and I'd ask for the next slide to be brought up, please. So where do we stand today? I think it's safe to say that pharma R&D finds itself in the perfect storm, in a vortex of forces pulling in different directions. On the one hand, the workload of pharma R&D is rising rapidly, and it's going to continue to rise rapidly. But R&D budgets are not keeping pace with this rising workload. So we are being forced to do more with less. In several cases, budgets have been flat, and in some cases are even shrinking. Unfortunately, we can't solve this by simply pumping more and more into the traditional model of R&D. The system just does not have the flex or the ability to expand its capacity enough to be able to handle this additional workflow or workload, right? It will not bend, it will not expand like a balloon. It's likely to break or burst, which is why I think it's safe to say that the math simply does not work. So the choices before R&D leaders today and what they make over the next few months and years will determine if these organizations set the pace for the future of healthcare or the future of medical research, or whether they struggle to catch up. Let's kind of look at, therefore, right, what are those push and pull factors? That's on the next slide. So what are the push and pull factors that pharma R&D finds itself in? I mentioned earlier that there is an ever-rising workload. Trial starts are rising by about 6% per year. And therefore, in the next 5 years or so, the workload in terms of number of trials itself will be more than 20% of what it is today. Safety events are rising even faster at approximately 15% per year. And trial designs are becoming more and more complex with decentralized clinical trials, new data streams, and more nuanced clinical trial protocols. So across the board, there is an increase in workload. But if we look at the second pillar in this slide, pharma companies find themselves under budgetary pressure. Overall, at an industry level, there are pricing pressures and patent cliff pressures. The R&D departments, the R&D teams, they are not immune to this pressure and are therefore consistently being asked to do more with less. Not just by way of more trials at a lower cost, but also by way of kind of delivering on these trials faster so that speed to market is accelerated and we can get the therapies to the patients who are in need in a timely manner. Currently, more than half the R&D budget is spent on manual processes. And while these have been continuing in the face of these the increase in workload, timelines between data lock to submission haven't improved much and continue to average approximately about 12 weeks, barring some exceptions, of course. Even if one were to remove the budgetary constraints and say, all right, we're just going to write a blank check, right? We are unlikely to see much improvement, primarily because of the operating model. As I mentioned earlier, the operating model is stretched, and additional investment in the same operating model will only yield diminishing returns. So against this backdrop, generative AI appears to be a shining beacon that can alleviate some of these problems. However, the promise of GenAI is still to be realized. From our discussions with senior leaders in the industry, we hear that there is significant investment going into point solutions, into agentification of workflows, but they are still struggling to demonstrate adequate ROI on that investment. And why is that? Primarily because systems are siloed. We are still running pilots. We seem to be in a pilot purgatory. There are just point solutions, but there isn't really a holistic view as to how these point solutions can get embedded into transforming an end-to-end workflow. And therefore, there's inadequate planning on how the use of GenAI has to be accompanied by an overall structural, shall we say, overhaul of the system. All of this is putting pressure on decision makers. How do they rebuild the plane while it is still flying? How can they derive short-term value to create widespread belief about the impact of technology in their organization while also embarking on a much more holistic transformation, whether it's organizational structures, whether it's processes, or whether it's technology itself? So with that, let me go to the next slide then. What is the R&D leader of today confronted with when it comes to adopting GenAI? I look at it as three broad areas. At the outset, one needs to recognize that the use of GenAI is not just a technology issue. It is much more than that. It can't be that we just use technology and leave everything else the same. And therefore, what are those other dimensions that you need to consider? The first, and perhaps the most important question, is about organizational structure. What should my team of the future look like? How should it be structured? Because the team is now not just humans, but it's humans and agents together. But how should it be structured so that it is agile and able to harness the power of technology? And more importantly, what skills will I need in that team in the future? So that's the first question, or the first dimension. Very important, that of people. The second, but equally important, is related to process. This is not about simply replacing select microprocesses by agents and bots. It is about reevaluating fundamentally the end-to-end workflow and designing the process with an overall business outcome in mind. Business outcomes such as, can I drive faster recruitment? Can I do faster data analysis? Can I drive faster submissions? How do I agentify repetitive tasks while enabling humans to focus on the more strategic and cerebral activities involved? And finally, there is the perennial question of build versus buy. If I were to build everything internally, can I be sure that I will always be at the bleeding edge of technology and innovation? If I were to partner, should I select a single partner or a federation of partners? And does anyone have a patent on the best solution always? Finally, it's about what do I keep in-house? What do I give outside? So we have a view on each one of these. And let me try and unpack some of this for you. Let's go to the next slide then. Let's start with organizational structure. While existing structures and the structures that have been traditional have served us well until now, they were designed for a slower world where tasks were performed manually, in silos and sequentially. Every function, whether it was discovery, clinical operations, safety, regulatory, CMC, worked within its own swim lane with tremendous emphasis on task-based expertise and efficiency. The handoffs from one function to the next represented points of friction, and therefore compromised agility. The siloed structures also resulted, if you will, in duplication of effort as well as expertise. So, how does that contrast with the future? In contrast, the future R&D organization will need to be agile, will need to be self-contained, modular, and most importantly, will have to be AI native by design. We're already seeing some of this in the industry, right? Some of the forward-thinking companies are beginning to organize their R&D function in agile Gen AI-enabled pods. By design, these pods are cross-functional and aligned towards the end objectives. The end objectives being faster to file, faster to patient, and not just driving functional level efficiency. Workflows within the pod are orchestrated by a Gen AI agent that routes tasks, engages the right AI models, and flags wherever human judgment and reasoning are necessary. The overall outcome of the pod is overseen by a human, who is the overall end-to-end owner of the program. Consequently, humans spend less time on repetitive task-oriented work and more time on high-value decision-making and strategy. Let's take an example of a clinical trial protocol. If we look at the traditional approach, it would have been sequential. Clinical development would draft the first version and pass it on to biostatistics weeks later, after which they would wait for regulatory affairs and clinical operations to weigh in on the feasibility and timelines. The whole process is slow. In contrast, think about the agile pod model. The agile pod consists of all the functional areas operating in an integrated fashion. Think of it as an exercise in parallel processing, with real-time exchange of information and insights between these different entities in the pod. So therefore, clinical development defines the scientific intent and patient population. In parallel, biostatisticians start to formulate the endpoints and the analytical plan from the very outset. You would have regulatory experts guiding alignment with evolving regulatory guidelines, whereas clinical operations provide timelines and feasibility based on thoughts and insights about sites and patient recruitment. In essence, therefore, instead of each of these activities happening sequentially, all these inputs get consolidated together and are used to dynamically design the protocol so that the first draft is very nearly the final one, with virtually no back and forth between these different entities. Now add on top of that generative AI. AI models will further supercharge the effort with knowledge from previous protocols, safety data, and regulatory guidelines. By doing this, the first draft could very well be close to the final draft and ready, if you will, within a matter of hours, if not minutes. Huge, huge benefit compared to what the traditional approach would have been. And this is not theory anymore. This is now beginning to get implemented in practice. In fact, there is increasing evidence in the public domain of companies having embraced this new way of organizing teams. If I were to just give you a few examples, Bayer Pharma has transformed to what they call dynamic strategic ownership models that replace rigid functions with agile cross-functional project-based teams that own outcomes and not individual tasks. Novartis and Microsoft have launched an AI innovation lab to embed specialists directly into R&D. Sanofi has built digital accelerators that put AI and data science inside cross-functional pods. And these are just some examples that have been shared publicly. I'm sure many of you are already doing some of this in your individual companies and implementing similar models. In this regard, the future seems to be here already. And I think you will agree with me that the cultural shift here is profound. Even if you look at safety, a safety physician no longer waits weeks for statisticians to analyze adverse events. AI agents immediately surface clusters in real time. A CMC scientist no longer spends hours assembling batch data. AI generates documentation directly from manufacturing systems, leaving the humans free to focus on quality strategy. So, what does this mean from an organizational shift? The organizational shift demands a fundamental reimagining of the roles and expertise of human talent that you need. In the future, GenAI will handle the repetitive activities such as drafting protocols, processing adverse events, reconciling submissions, maintaining spreadsheets of quality data, while humans will spend time deciding, validating outputs, supervising workflows, interpreting predictive for insights, and engaging regulators, physicians, and patients. This, what does it mean in terms of R&D talent, right? Does it reduce the role of the R&D talent? I would argue that it only elevates it. The future careers will be defined not by how many drafts you can put out, but by how well you orchestrate AI-enabled pods to deliver faster, better results. The results being faster to file, faster to patient. And even from an individual development perspective, this would be a much more fulfilling path for the talent that you have in your organization and is therefore essential to attract and retain the next generation of pharma R&D leaders. Let's go then to the next slide, which actually talks about the second important dimension of R&D transformation, and that is process reengineering. With the embedding of GenAI agents into the agile pods that we spoke about in the previous slide, R&D leaders must start to think about how do they redesign their workflows to account for this new paradigm of a human-agent coexistence. With new digital standards such as ICH M11 and USDM, the vision becomes even more powerful. A protocol authored in machine-readable form can flow seamlessly across the lifecycle. The same digital backbone connects TLFs, EDCs, the trial database, the CSRs, and ultimately the submission dossier. Every element is linked, so teams are not recreating the same information manually at every stage. When you combine these standards with GenAI and intelligent orchestration, you begin to start approaching the concept of a one-click submission. Instead of months of drafting, reconciling, and repackaging documents, an orchestrator agent can generate a submission package directly from trial data and connected components. Modules are pre-populated, tables validated against the source data, style and format checks applied automatically, and regulators receive a dossier that is both complete and machine readable. We are not yet there, but early pilots are already pointing the way. Some sponsors are already linking protocol standards directly to downstream outputs. Others are testing auto-population of CTD modules from prior submissions. Taken together, these advances bring us closer and closer to a world where submitting a new drug application is less about assembling documents and more about activating an integrated data and workflow. That is the promise of one-click submissions. Not just speed for its own sake, but the ability to free thousands of hours of expert time, improve consistency and quality across filings, and accelerate access for patients who are waiting for these treatments desperately. Once again, there are several examples of this already playing out in the real world, right? So we are seeing things in the public domain. For instance, again, if I look at what Bayer Pharma has done, they've redesigned submission preparation so that CTD modules are pre-drafted from trial data and prior submissions, allowing reviewers to validate instead of starting from scratch. Takeda has a platform that they call Shinrai, which uses GenAI for labeling and efficacy summaries, cutting down preparation time by up to 70% and enabling earlier engagement with the regulatory authorities. GlaxoSmithKline is piloting GenAI to auto-generate briefing packs for cross-functional reviews, reducing the friction between clinical, regulatory, and CMC. Pfizer is testing GenAI for CMC authoring. Sanofi and AstraZeneca are experimenting with AI-assisted protocol and label generation. Merck KGaA is piloting automated quality checks. Similarly, Amgen, BMS, Roche, they're all embedding GenAI into various kinds of use cases as they relate to regulatory affairs as well as R&D. And these are, mind you, not just efficiency tweaks. They represent a fundamental redefinition of the way we do things, from document preparation all the way to data activation. Let me go to the next slide and make this real with one more example, an example that we at Indegene have been working on and have met with some measure of success, and that's in medical writing. If we break it down, there are 13 different steps in medical writing, but today, through the use of GenAI, of these 13 steps that go into producing a clinical study report, only 3 are now led by humans. The rest of them have been significantly agentified. GenAI generates shells, drafts, fact checks, and applies formatting. Humans step in only where judgment and discretion is required, interpreting statistical outputs, guiding clarity, and giving final approvals. Early pilots have reduced cycle times by 40 to 60%, while also improving quality and consistency, because GenAI draws on prior submissions and knowledge graphs. The heavy lifting is automated, while expertise is elevated to where it matters most. So if we go to the next slide, that brings us to the third dimension. How should one think about what to agentify, what to keep in-house, what to partner on? I'd spoken about how important it will be for R&D leaders to think about their delivery model or their engagement model in the future. I spoke of partnerships. For decades, business leaders have been grappling with the question of how much work should we keep in-house and how much do we outsource? What do we build? What do we buy? And the winners in this will not be those who own the most internal capacity, but those who govern the most effective ecosystems of AI-augmented partners. This changes how we define core competence. Core competence is no longer about execution. It is orchestration. It is about setting standards, ensuring compliance, and directing where AI should be applied at scale. This build-buy-partner framework, as you see in the slide, helps clarify some of the choices. It helps guide the organization's strategy along 2 broad dimensions. How much judgment and discretion is required for a particular function? That's what you see on the x-axis. And how much does this excellence in that function represent a competitive differentiation? That's what you see on the y-axis. Using this framework, if you look at it, organizations must build and protect the areas that require the highest level of judgment and define true differentiation. This is what you see on the upper right quadrant. These are areas such as trial design, target selection, and regulatory strategy. That is something that you want to kind of build and protect. If you move to the upper left quadrant, this is where, the level of judgment required or discretion required is less, but it still constitutes a significant dimension in competitive differentiation. This is something that companies should enhance internally with GenAI tools where differentiation matters, but is not as dependent on judgment. These are things like regulatory intelligence scanning. If you go down to the lower left, what should you partner for scale in, right? You should partner for scale in activities where speed matters more than uniqueness. The highest levels of is not that dependent on judgment anymore. These will be areas such as real-world data curation, patient recruitment, medical writing, protocol optimization, data management. These are some of the areas which you can actually partner for. And then finally, if you move to the lower right quadrant, they should govern external functional service providers in areas that require both scale and judgment, but are not necessarily competitive differentiators, such as regulatory drafting, pharmacovigilance, and case intake, and biostatistics. We already see companies leading this shift. They are building ecosystems of AI native partners across discovery and clinical trials. They are forming alliances with startups to optimize protocols in real time. They are collaborating with AI platforms to accelerate biologics design. These are not future possibilities. They are signals of the new model that is already taking shape. So if we had to fast forward a few years, think about R&D leaders. What will they be asking? They will not be asking which tasks to outsource. They will be asking which capabilities should I be governing internally and which ecosystems do I orchestrate externally. Their competitive edge will no longer be the size of their internal team, but the strength of their AI-enabled network. That is the future we are moving towards and moving rapidly. If we go, therefore, to the final slide, really, it brings us back to what we started with. At the outset, I mentioned that GenAI is no longer an option, but the competitive edge. Those who learn to harness the power of GenAI today will lead the science and the market tomorrow. But more importantly, even if we leave aside competitive differentiation, business success, business outcomes, of course, we are in a competitive environment. However, at a higher level, more than anything else, it is our responsibility and duty as an industry to harness this technology in pursuit of our larger mission, and that is to serve the patients who are in need. With that, I would like to thank you all for participating in this Indegene Digital Summit. I hope that this day was well spent for all of you and that the content that was presented during the course of the day has inspired you about the future of this industry and how it is likely to transform. Thank you very much and stay safe wherever you are. Goodbye.